Hello again. I want to try to walk you through some of the arguments in section E of chapter 2 dealing with religion, morality, and evil. And the first three all really start with the recognition that we cannot prove the existence of God. But nonetheless, they try to argue in different ways that it makes sense to believe in God without having what we can call knowledge. Belief in God is a matter of faith rather than of knowledge in all three of these arguments. The first is Immanuel Kant's, and it's based on the idea of morality, that morality is necessary for human existence. In that he believes that we all have a duty to act morally towards others, and we're going to find out when we talk about Kant's ethics that it is essentially to always act in the way that we can will that everyone act. He calls it the categorical imperative. And he also carries in that idea the idea that for us to be able to, that we have a kind of an intuitive idea that moral action ought to lead to happiness for ourselves and others. That we think that doing good should lead to happiness and well-being, but in fact, in everyday experience, it doesn't always seem that way in this world. And therefore, Kant is arguing that for moral behavior to be possible, we kind of logically have to assume the idea of immortality and of the existence of God, that there is a level of reality beyond what we can immediately perceive with our senses, that works to create what he calls, middle of page 151, the coincidence of happiness with morality. That cause of the whole of nature, of course, refers to God. And so he thinks that the whole idea of morality makes it logically necessary to assume the existence of God. Now, what he's wrestling with, and your author at the bottom of that page makes a common mistake. Kant is not really addressing the question of why we should be moral. He's addressing a different and I think more important question, and that is, how can we be moral? In order for us to commit ourselves to do what is right, regardless of the apparent immediate consequences, he thinks it is logically necessary for us to presume that God exists and that there is a life beyond this one. It's how can we be moral? And he thinks that reason tells us that in order for us to act that way, we must assume the existence of God and of immortality. Now, William James, beginning page 152, goes about it in a somewhat different way. He starts off with what he sees as being two basic assumptions that religion makes. Two things it says. The first is that the best things are the more eternal things. That there is good beyond the pleasures of the senses, beyond physical pleasures. And the second affirmation he says that religion makes is that we're better off even now if we believe that that first affirmation is true. And so he says religion is offering a momentous option that we gain by believing and we lose by not believing. And secondly, that it is a forced option. That we can't just say, well, I'll wait until I can be sure. Now, partly James thinks that we can't ever really be sure. But the logic here is that if we decide to not decide, that is in fact deciding not to believe. You can't avoid making a decision. And so no matter which way you choose, he says there is a risk. He draws the analogy that I can relate to, that with asking someone to marry you. Can you wait until you know what they're going to be like 40 years from now? Well, probably not. And if you do, you miss out on that 40 years of relationship. So you have to choose. And either way, there is an element of risk. Now, what he is saying simply is that it makes as much sense in that scenario to risk believing and the possibility of being disappointed as it makes to not believe and miss out on the benefits that religion says it offers. We'll talk a little bit later about kind of what's called a leap of faith. And I think that fits in well with what he's saying here, that it makes as much sense one way or the other. That it is logically reasonable to decide, I'm going to go for it. I'm going to take the chance. I think that I may benefit more by doing this than I will benefit by not doing it. Now, his argument also allows a person to say, well, I think the other way around. I think it's better to not risk it. And I think James, being the pragmatist that he is, acknowledges that. It's not like it's a sure thing. But in order to get the benefit, you have to run the risk. And there's no way to avoid running that risk. You have to make a choice. And either choice you make carries with it a risk. I asked a long time ago a then young lady to marry me, and she agreed, and it has worked out well. We're still married 41 years later. Had I not run the risk, I would have missed out on all those years. You know, if we'd somehow just kept dating until we got to this point, I'm not sure she would have done that. But even if we had, we would have missed out. And I say that knowing that it doesn't always work out. Okay? But James's point is that either choice that you make carries with it a risk, and there's no way to say that one risk makes more sense than the other. Now, Blaise Pascal carries that a bit further with his famous wager. Basically, he says, and your book even gives you a chart on page 155, if we choose to believe and we're right, God exists, then we gain an eternal reward. If we choose to believe and it turns out we're wrong, God doesn't exist, we've made a mistake, but it's a beautiful mistake. On the other hand, if we choose to not believe and we're wrong, God does exist, we're in serious trouble. Kind of like the person who decides not to do the assignments and hopes that everybody will pass. If we choose not to believe and it turns out we're right, we don't really gain anything. We don't lose anything either. Now, what his point is in this is that he thinks it makes better sense to believe. That, if you balance the risk and the reward, it works in favor of belief. Now, your textbook points out that all of these arguments are based on the assumption of God as just, as good. And Western religions have tended to have a traditional concept of God with, I think, at least three components. God is omnipotent, all-powerful. God is omniscient, all-knowing. And God is all good. But that then raises the question of why is there evil in the world? Why is there suffering? And that's a very old question. In fact, page 156, it's a question wrestled with in the book of Job. in the book of Job, there is a really good man who is really well off. And in one of the dominant strains of thought in the Bible, the idea of the covenant, if you do the will of God, you prosper. If you don't, you suffer. The book of Job, in part, is written to raise the question: is it really that simple? But he expects his audience to understand that Job is rich because he's good. Well, there is a bet that is made between God and Satan. And the Satan character in the book of Job is not the Christian devil. The word Satan actually means accuser. And in the book of Job, Satan is the district attorney, the prosecutor in God's government. He is part of God's administration. It's his job to call to God's attention people who are misbehaving so that God can punish them as they deserve. And there's a conversation between God and Satan where God, hey, when you were down there checking people out, did you notice how good Job is? And Satan says, well, yeah, but he's good because it pays off. Which raises an interesting question. If we do the right thing for the sake of a reward, how good is that really? Doesn't that suggest that we would do the wrong thing if it paid off better? And essentially what happens is that Satan says, I bet Job would not be good if it doesn't pay. And God says, I bet he would. Well, there's only one way to settle that, right? And that is to make it not pay. And so suddenly Job loses all of his kids, all of his wealth, loses his health. People in the ancient world tended to assume that if you were sick, it was because God or one of the gods was angry with you over something. Now, Job's wife says, curse God and die, which is an interesting statement. I mean, what's she really mean? Is she saying that he should say, well, God damn God? No, what it really means is, as she points out in that, just before that, are you still unshaken in your integrity? Forget this being good stuff. It doesn't pay off. And Job refuses that line of reasoning. If we accept good from God, shall we not accept evil as well? Job's friends give him the pious Orthodox Sunday school answer, you must have done something awful for God to do this to you. And Job refuses to accept that, and he winds up questioning God's fairness. And truth be told, God's not being fair to him. And he demands that God come down here and answer some questions. Well, at the end of the book, God actually does that. But the answer that he gives Job as to why all this happens, because Job knows nothing about the bet, is basically God says to Job, who are you to question me? If the question in the book of Job is the question debated by Job and his friends, why do bad things happen to good people? The answer that the book offers is that the answer is beyond human comprehension. You know, why does a tornado hit one house and destroy it, and an identical house 100 yards away unscathed? I don't know. And I don't think anybody else does. Seems to me it could just as easily have happened the other way around. But the other question in the book The one that's the bet between God and Satan, I think is more interesting. And that is, are human beings capable of doing what is right simply because it's right? Or will they only do what's right if they're rewarded for it? And there the book gives a clear answer. Because Job never abandons his integrity, his goodness. See, what's really being tested is not Job's faith, but his faithfulness. Will he obey God when it doesn't pay? And he does. And a Jewish philosopher named Abraham Joshua Heschel commented that it's important enough to the author to be able to say, yes, human beings are capable of doing what is right simply because it's right. That he's willing to run the risk of having God appear to be unfair in order to be able to say that. Now, one of the answers to the problem of evil that is made in the Christian tradition in particular is the idea of free will and carrying with that original sin, human sinfulness. And I've got another video with actually two answers. One from someone you have a little bit of in your book, Augustine. The other is another early Christian thinker, Irenaeus. But what I want to look at is what is in your book. And I'm actually going to go beyond what's in your book from Augustine and his understanding of free will. He is reflecting on this problem of evil, and he does not want to say that God is the cause of evil, because then that, in a sense, makes God evil. And he points out, page 157, that we do evil because we choose to do so of our own free will. And he recognizes you can't get around this by claiming, well, the devil made me do it. Because who made the devil? Well, if you think about it for a minute, and here I'm going to other things that I've read from Augustine that's not in your book. For humans to be able to do good, if they had no choice, would that really be good? I mean, if somebody gives you some money because they're worried about, whether you're able to make ends meet, that's good. That feels good. But if somebody gave you money because you put a gun to their head and demanded it, would that communicate the same idea of caring about you? You see what I'm getting at? That, if it's not done freely, it doesn't have the same value. And so God gave us free will in order that we would be able to genuinely do good by choice. But that carries with it a risk. Because if I can choose to do good, then I can also choose to not do good. But in order for there to be genuine goodness, there has to be that element of choice. And so it's not God who chose evil. It is us. And all of God's creation is good. Well, then where does evil come from? Evil, for Augustine, is not a thing in itself. It's not really good versus evil. It's good and there is the absence of good, or less good. And Augustine actually thinks that evil is simply a distorted good. You know, I want to be loved, but sometimes I'll settle for being flattered. Or I want to be loved, but I might settle for sex. Page 159. For you, and the Confessions is written to God. Evil does not exist, not only for you, but for the whole of your creation as well, because there's nothing outside it which could invade it and break it down, the order which you've imposed on it. But the separate parts of your creation, in them there are some things that we think of as evil because they're at variance with other things. But in themselves, they too are good. You know, there's nothing wrong with sex in and of itself. But context matters for Augustine, and I think rightly. Okay. Something can be good in itself, but if it's out of place, or if it's too much, or in the wrong way, it becomes evil. In the wintertime, it's nice to have a furnace that heats up the house. But you don't want that fire outside of the furnace, because then it destroys the house. The fire's not a bad thing in itself, but if it's not controlled, if it's not properly contained, if it's not where you want it to be, it becomes evil. That's the way that Augustine looks at evil. Now, I want to introduce something else here. Classically in the discussion of evil, in Western thought at least, there are two kinds of evil that are distinguished. There is natural evil and there is moral evil. And they're not the same thing. Moral evil is undoubtedly of human cause. Slavery. Some people enslave other people. Okay. Clearly that has a human cause. Natural evil is when suffering is caused not by someone else doing something that's morally wrong to a person, but is caused by nature. A hurricane, a tornado, an earthquake. Who do you blame for that? Okay, I mean you can't say, well, so and so did this to me. Um, and so it's easy to blame human sinfulness for moral evil. And human history is chock full of horrific evil that people have done to one another. Natural evil, human beings play a part. We choose to live in places that are prone to being hit by hurricanes or tornadoes or earthquakes. But it's kind of rooted in nature. Rather than in human activity. Now, one way, page 161, of kind of getting around this, that was popular in the late 1700s, was the idea of deism. I really get a kick out of listening to all the Republicans talk about how America was established as a Christian nation. Most of the founding fathers were actually deists. And basically, deism was the belief that God created the world and then left it to run on its own. Now, in a way that absolves God of evil, maybe, but as your author points out, it raises the question, is the deist God really God? The Indian religions have a completely different take on this. Page 162, the Hindu idea of karma, which basically is that the choices I make not only change the world around me, but they change me. I tell a lie. Well, pretty soon I have to tell another lie to cover that lie. And then I have to tell another lie to cover that lie. And first thing you know, I am a person who habitually lies. And in Hinduism, that doesn't just affect me for this life, but because of the belief in reincarnation, the idea that the soul goes through countless lives, it affects the kind of person I am in future lives as well. And so, in essence, we choose our destiny. In the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, there are a lot of discussions of Hindu philosophy, but the selection you have in your book points out that we have dharma. Dharma is duty. We have to act. In fact, the word dharma comes from the word for action. We have to act. You cannot avoid action. You cannot avoid decisions and choices. The question is, why do you make the choices you make? And we need to strive to free ourselves from attachment so that all of our actions are offerings to God. That we don't pay attention to gain in the selection we have in the book, Arjuna, the hero of the Bhagavad Gita, is supposed to sound the trumpet that's going to start this battle between, on one side, he and his brothers, and their cousins. Now, the two sides in the Mahabharata, the larger Indian epic of which the Bhagavad Gita is part, represent, Arjuna and his brothers represents order. Their cousins represent chaos. Now, that's not quite the same as good and evil, but it's kind of close. It's his duty as a warrior to fight this battle. And Krishna, his chariot driver, who's actually a god in human form, advises him to do his duty, fight the battle. Don't worry about consequences. You know, I know you think you would rather be defeated than to kill your relatives. It's not in the selection you have, but actually Krishna points out that nobody really dies because the real self, the Atman, the soul, cannot die. So no one will really be killed. You're not thinking about things the way they really are. You're thinking about them the way they appear to be. But don't focus on consequences. You know, you shouldn't be motivated by what you will get out of it. Pure action is action that's undertaken without desire. Without desire for the fruits of works. One needs to be free from the motive of personal desire. Untouched by jealousy. Equal-minded and balanced in the face of both success and failure. That's the person whose actions are not bound by karma. He is liberated. His mind fixed in knowledge of things as they really are. And all of his actions are sacrifice to God. Now, Buddhism avoids the problem of evil in a somewhat different way. Although Buddhism is undeniably a religion, there really is no God figure in Buddhism, especially not Theravada Buddhism. And rather, human suffering is caused by our selfish craving. And this suffering is inevitable in this world. This world is nowhere near perfect. In fact, it's ultimately unreal. And the Buddhist solution to suffering is that the suffering we encounter in this world ought to move us to compassion, developing a kind of general compassion towards all without being attached to any in particular. You know, a lot of our, what we call love, is actually possessive. Think about the way we talk about my friend, my wife, my girlfriend, my child. It's selfish. In Mahayana Buddhism, you're encouraged to become what they call a bodhisattva, a person who accepts rebirth in order to build up enough merit for everyone to reach salvation. A great Buddhist story that makes that point of developing this kind of compassion for all. A woman whose child had died came to the Buddha and wanted him to bring her child back to life. Well, to kind of get the point across, he told her he would do that if she could bring him, I think it was a grain of rice. from a house that has never been touched by death. And so she sets out to find such a house. But of course, there are none. And that's kind of the point. As she goes from house to house, she begins to kind of try to comfort them when she discovers that they too have experienced loss. And, only a person who has experienced a particular loss can really relate to someone who has experienced the same kind of loss. And so they kind of comfort each other. And eventually she forgets all about trying to find a grain of rice from a house that's been untouched by death, and simply becomes what amounts to a grief counselor, channeling her grief into compassion for others. That's the Buddhist response to suffering in this world. Okay, see you again next time.